Hey guys, in this lecture today, we are going to be talking about King Philip's War and then something brewing in a little town called Salem, which actually comes from a Hebrew word called shalom. Shalom means hello and goodbye, and also peace be with you. Kind of ironic considering all the death and destruction in the witch trials. So here we go. All right, the Confederation of New England forms in the 1640s. The only really significant thing you need to remember about this is that some of the New England colonies, four of them, that's going to be Plymouth, where the Pilgrims are at, Massachusetts Bay with the Puritans and Boston there, Hartford and New Haven, that's going to eventually form Connecticut. Those four colonies, not Rhode Island, remember Roger Williams was a troublemaker. Those four colonies, though, are going to form this confederation. The actual word confederation, by the way, if you didn't know, that means a loosely bound group of nation states that have an alliance with each other. Think of kind of like the European Union today. England, France, Spain, Italy, all these European countries have a confederation, but they are still their own sovereign nations at the same time. You also have minus the Brexit controversy. We're not going to get into that right now. You also have like the Southern Confederacy during the Civil War. Each of the Southern states, they were wanting a lot more autonomy. That's why they formed a confederation style government instead of more of like the Union government, the republic that we have with the United States. And they do this in the 1640s because remember, that's when the English Civil War was going on. We talked about that last time in the last lecture. The English Civil War was largely the Roundheads, the Puritans versus the Kingsmen, the Cavaliers, the Royalists, and looking to basically shore up that Puritan support. They are also trying to foment the Puritan cause back in the Americas. They're also wanting to secure borders against native attack. Remember, we had the Pequot Wars. And so, for those reasons, they formed this confederation. And it's going to be, again, the only really important thing here is it's going to be like the first time that several of the colonies decide, hey, maybe we would be stronger working together. Doesn't really accomplish any of the goals it's set out to do, though. Neither the Puritan cause nor the defending against natives, but still kind of significant. There you go. Now we're going to skip forward a few decades and round out the Native American interaction with the New England settlers with this event known as King Philip's War. Begins in 1675, and then it's going to culminate in 1676 with King Philip's death. So King Philip is actually the Native American who's kind of seen as the leader of this Native American war we're going to have in the Massachusetts area. His real name was Metacom, and he is the son of Massasoit, who, if you are an eagle-eared person, I don't even know if that's the thing, eagle-eared, it's supposed to be like eagle-eyed. Anyway, you might recall that Massasoit was the Native American chieftain of the Wampanoag. So here's the thing. King Philip's War is going to be one of the most bloody, one of the most underrated, unheard of, but most significant Native American wars, especially considering this is the last time Native Americans in the New England area are able to put up a big resistance. After this, they're kind of done and pushed off. The Iroquois will be the only ones left, and they have a trade alliance. And it started by, ironically, the tribe that it all began with, the Wampanoags, who greeted the Pilgrims and allowed the Pilgrims to survive, help them in the first Thanksgiving and all of that. It's the Wampanoags, their oldest friend, who's going to be their major enemy here in the 1670s in King Philip's War. So Metacom is the son of Massasoit, the Wampanoag chief that had helped the Pilgrims in the 1620s. His older brother, King Philip's older brother, and he was called King Philip by the English, was named by the English Alexander, ironically, because Philip is the younger brother here. And if you are remembering from world history, that's kind of cool because Alexander is the son of Philip of Macedonia, and Alexander goes on to become Alexander the Great and all this. So, kind of foretelling that these are great chieftains. So Metacom is trying to do right by his people, and he grows up knowing a lot of Englishmen as well. So it's very strange that he would be the guy that would wreak such havoc and terror into the Englishmen's hearts, because he really does want to try to make the best of both worlds. And he knows his father and his father's role in helping the English get a foothold in this new world. But what they've been dealing with in the past several decades are further and further encroachment on their lands by English farms. The Englishmen have extended from the coast, and the the more generations you have, the less and less land you have, and they're further getting onto Indian land. This is kind of what we saw with the Powhatan, with Chief Opechancanough down there with Virginia. Eventually, they rise up when they see that the English just aren't going to stop coming over. Also, another thing that really upsets the Native Americans was the English practice with their livestock. This might not seem like a big deal, but English farmers would very routinely allow their cattle and their pigs, especially the pigs, to go and have free range to graze wherever. And they would be grazing on the foliage all around and in the forest and everywhere. And for the Native Americans, this was a problem that was twofold. Not only is the livestock eating their food source, their native crops that they would grow in like the milpas sort of design, all the crops in one place. So that was really annoying. But then also you have to remember that these cattle and pigs, they're eating the vegetation that the Native Americans, you know, animals that they would hunt, turkeys and deer would normally be eating on. So they're cutting the natives off of food supply left and right. And Philip tries his best to get a moratorium on land sales. When that doesn't work, he just starts selling off a lot of land. Not because he wants to, but he has a bigger picture in mind. He uses the money from those land sales to basically go and purchase firearms from the Dutch. Because remember, the Dutch are below us. We're talking about New England, Massachusetts is. Down below is the settlement of New Netherlands, where you have like New Amsterdam and the Hudson River and all of that. And the Dutch were more than willing to sell firearms to the Native Americans, particularly those that have beef with the English, who are the Dutch's rival there. And so Philip is playing the long game. In 1671, it all comes almost to a head. The English fear that Philip is doing what he is actually doing in securing lots of firearms and planning something big. And Philip basically talks everybody down, and they hold off. 4 years later, this is when the war is going to erupt. John Samoset, he was one of these praying Indians. I think we talked about this at the Pequot War, but remember, if you're of a Native American tribe and you want to do business with the Englishmen, you want to get their alcohol, you want to get their guns, you want to get their axes, their steel, metal tools, not steel, but you want to get their metal tools, you want to trade with the Englishmen, you were kind of required to join one of those praying towns. They were on the western edges of English settlement, so they would form kind of the barrier between the Englishmen and the wild savage lands where the Native Americans were. And if you wanted to trade, you'd have to live in these praying towns, and you would have to, as the name implies, convert to Christianity. You'd have to adopt the habits of the Englishmen. So basically, like assimilation. You'd have to give up your native way of life, your language. You have to cut your hair. You'd have to change your clothing. All of this just so you could do business with them. It was pretty ridiculous. So John Samoset, he was one of these praying Indians of these barrier villages. And he comes up to the English, warning them that Philip is planning an attack. And they're like, okay, all right. But then 3 weeks later, John Samoset is killed mysteriously, and nobody knows if it was the English that did it or if it was the natives that do it. But the Englishmen are now super suspicious because this guy just said Philip was about to start something. So they have three Native Americans, one of whom was like a close advisor to Philip, brought in for questioning and immediately sentenced as guilty of conspiracy and the death of their praying Indian, John Samoset, and sentenced to death. Now, for Philip and the Wampanoag, they have long suspected and long kind of known that they are being treated subservient by the English. But this confirms it, that their sovereignty means nothing to the Englishmen, that here you have the death of a Native American and you have these suspects, Native American, and it's the Englishmen that are meting out the justice. Philip is outraged and probably under immense pressure from his tribal council as well. Many other neighboring allies of the Wampanoag are putting pressure on him, and so he calls to war. They're going to war over this, and they end up attacking nearly half of the villages and towns in the New England settlements, particularly Massachusetts, very hard in what has become King Philip's War. They are so fierce, they drive most of the Englishmen almost all the way to the coast, right on the outskirts of Boston. A lot of the Englishmen were so fearful that this was the end, and they so distrustful of all Native Americans, even those that had assimilated, the praying Indians, that they gathered those praying Indians who were nearby to them all together, and they put them on this little island right in Boston's harbor called Deer Island, right in the middle of winter in December of 1675. It was awful. They didn't give them any extra clothing or blankets or anything to build any shelter with. And so they basically, all these hundreds of men, women, and children of these peaceful Indians who had agreed to live under English rule and convert to Christianity, they sentenced to a terrible, agonizing death by exposure and starvation on Deer Island in the middle of Boston Harbor in that winter, out of their fear. So I mean, this was just an awful thing, and both sides committed terrible atrocities. This was guerrilla warfare. 12, 12 villages in Massachusetts were just burned to the ground, destroyed. And so that was kind of the high point for the natives. But over the next several months, the Englishmen eventually beat them back. Remember that for the Englishmen, their advantages were much greater. They had better firearms. They, of course, had way more access to firearms, so their volume was much greater. And so eventually they do overcome Philip and his warriors. And at the end, Philip retires to his own village, kind of resigned to his fate, um, and he gets shot and killed. And because he was seen as a traitor, remember, this is Metacom. Philip was his English name. He grew up among English and Indians, known him his whole life. They don't allow him to be buried because he's seen as a traitor. They cut off his body parts and display them in various English villages and towns throughout Massachusetts. Famously, his head was cut off. He was decapitated, and his severed head was put on a spike right outside of Plymouth. Yes, the same Plymouth where the Pilgrims had once been allowed to live and helped to survive by Philip's father, Massasoit. His hand was given to the Englishman who had shot him. This was just absolutely brutal, bloody warfare. And it's forever cemented the idea in the Englishmen for like the next 100 years that Native Americans were savage warriors that were bent out for their blood. So that was King Philip's War. Oh, and Philip's wife, he was very young when all this happened. He was only about 24, 25. His wife and son, like a lot of the Wampanoag people who survived, which there weren't a lot of, and their native allies, those that survived were rounded up and taken on slave ships down to the Caribbean and put into slavery. Yeah, so now, the reason the next thing we're talking about is the famous Salem witch trials is because it's out of this atmosphere of fear and paranoia, and uncertainty about Native American attacks, about religious strife in England, and about chaotic rule, what's going on with the government back in England. It's out of all this uncertainty that you get the atmosphere that will create how it's possible for little girls to blame older women and get them killed. 19 people will die in Salem. And there's a Salem town and there's a Salem village. The attacks actually happen in Salem Village, which you cannot actually find on a map today, interestingly enough. There is a Salem, Massachusetts, but that was Salem town. That was kind of the more wealthier side. Salem Village, where the witch trials take place and all the famous, happenstance with this, they are so branded for this craziness that to try to move on and relinquish this terrible legacy, they changed the village's name, and that is today on the map. That is Danvers, Massachusetts. So they changed the name. It was so bad what happened there. Of the 19 people that were killed as witches, you have 14 of them being women witches, and then you have 5 men who were also killed. And normally, you think of a witch in medieval times and being burned at the stake, right? They didn't burn any of these people that were accused of witchcraft at the stake. They were actually all of them hung to death, except for one man who was had a board placed across him as he lay prostrate on the ground, and they added more and more weight, like the weight of rocks, to the board as he lay under it. Every time that he refused to confess to anything, he would just say, "More weight, more weight." Are you a wizard? Are you a witch? More weight. Confess, more weight, until he was finally killed by being pressed to death. And I think the question really, when it comes down to it, is why did this happen? How could this have happened, right? How could these Puritans, who were very literate, somewhat seems very intelligent people for the 1600s, how could they allow this to happen? This was 1692, 1693 in New England. How could they allow this to happen? Why did it occur? And there's many different plausible theories that historians have come up with. So we're just going to go into a few, and I'll go into kind of the background of this first. But basically, it all starts with the household of Reverend Paris. He has his daughter Abigail Paris and Ann Putnam and a few other young girls. Think like ages 8 to 12. Okay, and the older ones, think of like those middle school girls. Okay, because that's what we're talking about here. They were very enamored of spending time with the servants of the Paris household. And by the way, Paris he was the town minister, and not a very liked one. He was pretty unpopular. His sermons were pretty boring. And by the way, in Puritan society, a sermon would typically be about 3 hours. If you are a particularly monotone or uncaptivating minister, that could be extreme torture. So Paris was very unliked. Anyway, these little girls, they were enamored of the household servant, the slave Tituba. Tituba's origin is a little bit mysterious, but we know that she was definitely an outsider in this very English Puritan community. She was from the Caribbean. It's likely that her skin was darker. We think that she probably had some African ancestry and probably as well some Native American ancestry from the Caribbean. But Tituba would enamor the girls out in the woods with, um, fortune tellings, who they were going to eventually marry. And she would, amaze them with tricks like floating egg whites and things. And eventually they get caught. And the girls immediately, not wanting to get in trouble in this very strict Puritan community, they blame Tituba and they basically start convulsing, like shaking and pretending like they're having spasms, and saying that they were under the control of witches, and that's why they were doing this stuff and behaving immorally in this Puritan society. Now, witchcraft was something that people not just in Salem or in the Americas believed in from like 1400 to like all the way till 1800, there's over 50,000 people that were killed, quote unquote, for witchcraft. But again, nothing like the concentrated efforts in this little tiny community of Salem village in Massachusetts in 1692, 1693. And the idea of witchcraft, it goes to the idea that usually a woman, if you were a man, you'd be convicted of wizardry, um, was controlling your specter and harming your specter, or they would send out their own specter to go and torment you at night. And if bad things, calamities, mysterious illnesses, bad luck happened, it was this witch sending their specter or controlling other specters, making these bad things happen. And so that was one of the basic ideas behind witchcraft and witchcraft trials. And so there was a precedent for this, and it is amazing. But Puritan society was very patriarchal. It was led by men, but these men get totally hoodwinked and led astray, it seems, by these young girls who likely, maybe they were suffering from lead poisoning. That's one of the various theories. But most likely they were just living in this strict society, and they were young teenage girls looking for attention, and they were given attention by the town elders, the leaders of the church. These men in charge of the trials gave them unprecedented power by paying them this sort of attention. There could have also been politics involved as well. A lot of those that are accused are going to be older women. They're going to be outcasts from society. And most importantly, they're going to be, sorry, animal stuff. And most importantly, they're going to be low ranking in the church and probably hadn't attended the church in quite a while. Tituba, when she is on trial, and this is the only way you could really get off, is she admitted to witchcraft, and she immediately goes and blames like 9 other people. Thanks, Tituba. And so by admitting to this, but then saying, well, it wasn't my fault. I was being controlled by the specter of someone else. If you blame someone else for why you were doing it, you could get off. But if you admitted to straight up being a witch, or if you denied being a witch, you were sentenced to death, because, of course, there is this little part in the Bible that says, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." And the first women that are accused, you have Sarah Osborne, who was this older woman who had married an indentured servant. She was quite poor, and very frail and sickly at this point. Her husband was dead. She was not attending church, so she was kind of an outcast from society and socially, also kept isolated. And then you have Sarah Good, who was the town beggar woman, who was filthy and begging for coins, not attending church, extremely poor. A lot of these hundreds of women that are going to be accused of witchcraft, they had that in common, that they were some way different in society. A lot of them were widows who controlled land, or had power in this male-led Puritan society, and maybe they were seen as a threat. There's a lot of historians who think that a lot of this might have been caused because of the extreme misogyny that existed in Puritan society, the sexism, that it was a way to keep women down. But there were some men killed as well. Some of the husbands who were tied to their wives or who tried to defend them. Those are the 5 men who were killed. There was also 2 dogs that were accused of witchcraft and were executed by hanging. So yes, this was full-on insanity. And eventually, it's going. Oh, and one, sorry, one more thing. There was one 4-year-old that was accused of witchcraft, and while she was waiting for her trial, in jail, they had to make special shackles for this little 4-year-old because, of course, all of the shackles that they had were too big for her tiny little wrists. Just absolutely ridiculous. And during the trials, they were looking for spectral evidence. Like, they were looking to see if your specter, your ghost, your spiritual form was attacking. And so the girls would offer up this evidence. The accusers, these little girls that are accusing these older women and stuff, they would offer up this evidence by pointing their fingers and then starting to convulse and pretending to choke and other stuff, really annoying stuff. And then pointing and saying, "She's doing this to me. She's hurting me. Oh my God." I would lose it at them. I would lose it really bad. And 19 people died. It was insane. It's finally going to end when the governor of Massachusetts, his wife is accused of witchcraft. And that's when the governor's like, I think you've gone far enough. And he's going to shut this down. The lieutenant governor, like the vice governor, he was like, no, we need to go further. That guy was insane. But all of this, remember, it comes from a place of fear. These people's lives were very uncertain. Maybe politically, a lot of this could have been attributed to the fact that Salem Village was a lot more poor than its neighbors, Salem Town, and maybe they were hunkering for the land. If you got accused of witchcraft, you would lose your land. You'd go to jail, and the government would get your land and your riches. And so some family rivalries might have been attributed to this as well. And the accusation stuff, it just gets me every time thinking about this. It's like if I accuse Daniela, you don't know which Daniela, which is why I'm using you for the example. I love both of you, by the way. So sorry, you're my example guinea pig here. But if I say that Daniela cheated on her reading quiz, okay, this is like being accused of witchcraft. This is the metaphor we're going for, all right? And she said, "No, Mrs. Ramsey, I didn't cheat." Well, I'd say, well, that's exactly what somebody who would cheat on their reading quiz would say. Okay. So you're either, excuse my language, but you're either damned if you do, damned if you don't. There was really no winning there. People who were accused of witchcraft, they they were going to be going down either way. And a lot of them, to admit that they were guilty was to give up the very thing that built their faith upon. Because remember, as Puritans, they follow the Calvinist teachings of the elect and the damned. That basically, they're living moral lives because they want those signs that they're going to heaven. If they admit to doing this, then they're basically damning themselves to hell. Then again, if they don't admit it, then they're also seen as guilty. One of the ways to test if you were a witch was to drown a witch in a river, you know. And basically, if the woman did indeed drown and die, well, then she was probably innocent. But if she managed to float up to the top, then she was definitely guilty, and then she'd be executed. So either way, you would die. They also had like a special group of women jurors during the trial who would sequester an accused witch on trial in a room that adjoined the courtroom, and they would inspect her naked body for any additional signs of witchery, like having a third teat, which is really disgusting, but that's, or like a birthmark on your bottom, or in different like odd places. If you had any kind of deformities, they could attribute that to your witchcraft. It was all kinds of really crazy things. Maybe there was lead poisoning. Maybe it was because of how scary life was on the frontier, so close to Native Americans. Because remember, this is happening in the years right after King Philip's War. Or maybe it's the idea of um, the restoration, that the king has just come back on the crown, and the Puritans have suffered quite a blow with that. And they're looking to kind of shore up Puritan power there, but it's getting kind of out of hand. Like I said, maybe possibly done to show that to the mother country that they could police their own, but it's dramatically backfiring if that was the case. James II, he's going to institute the Navigation Acts beginning in the 1650s. The Navigation Acts are going to be the beginning of where we talk about taxation. So you hear acts, think taxation during this early colonial period. They're a form of mercantilism. Mercantilism is the idea that colonies should support the mother country to help it grow and become powerful, that they're all part of the greater empire. And the Navigation Acts, that's where valuable goods from the colonies, think like the cash crops such as tobacco, later on cotton, fish, timber, these cash crops would be taxed heavily and they would be forced to be sent um, on British ships to London, to England, before they could be sold to other nations. So that way, England made sure that it got all of the taxes, all of the profits. Um, and this is going to be incredibly restrictive to these colonists who, for decades before this, before the 1650s, had been doing their own thing. And it's just going to get more and more burdensome as we continue on our way eventually to the 1700s and we get closer to that American Revolution. So the Navigation Acts are really where this tension between England's authority on the colonies and taxation really begins. All right. Well, before we get to the middle colonies, we're going to end it there. I hope that maybe you learned a little bit about the Salem witch trials, and maybe, hopefully, you learned something about King Philip's War, which is often never discussed. But I look forward to seeing you guys in class, and I will catch you later.